we are still nowhere near World War III. One glaring inconsistency between now and the two previous world wars was right before those wars started. In World War I, the Axis powers were growing by gobbling up a bunch of little pieces of land, and the same thing happened right before World War II. Leading up to both world wars, Germany kept making these very successful land and power grabs, and the rest of Europe just had to take it up until they couldn't take it anymore. But none of our enemies are making successful land grabs. In fact, they've been losing it. Russia has been at war with Ukraine for 3 years, and they've only taken 20% of the territory. In fact, Russia has lost a little chunk of theirs to the Ukrainians since August, and since that time, they have not been able to take that land back. The Russian military has lost over 760,000 troops and the better part of their tanks, and that was supposed to be their ace in the hole that took down Ukraine in less than a week. Russia can't even win against a NATO-armed Ukraine, more or less a NATO country. Let's look at Iran, the number one cause of instability in the Middle East. Every single one of their proxy militias have had entire decapitation strikes where there is no more leadership, and each of those militias have lost almost every single thread of any kind of tactical capacity to wage against the West. Don't forget the fact that their number one enemy, Israel, has launched several successful attacks within Iran, in the capital, and Iran has been able to barely do any form of retaliation that did any lasting damage to Israel, while Israel has managed successful attacks against a lot of military infrastructure. Syria was supposed to be a supreme military, tactical, and diplomatic nexus for both Russia and Iran, and that has fallen just in the past few weeks. There's a mass exodus of Russian armed forces and navy leaving Syria because they no longer have access to what they need. Syria was a huge munitions producer for Iran and also a corridor to get them into Lebanon. That's gone. They lost it. Both the US and Israel, once the Assad regime fell, have conducted airstrike after airstrike to take apart any piece of Assad's Syrian military infrastructure, including the Air Force. There is no Syrian Air Force. There is no Syrian Navy. There may be a Syrian army, but it's not Assad's. A series of diplomatic, tactical, and economic losses suffered by both Iran and Russia doesn't give them the gumption or the momentum to go to war with anybody. But what about China? They're more powerful than both Russia and Iran put together. Aren't they a threat? China is the world's largest food importer. 20 years ago, they were about 92% food independent, and today they're about 69%. The Chinese government's number one ace in the hole to keep their population at peace is to make sure they're adequately fed. Any kind of war they would declare would result in a food and energy blockade, and there's nothing that Russia would be able to do about it. How would this country successfully fight NATO if they didn't have oil for their military infrastructure or food to even feed their troops or the population they need to produce the goods? Another major Chinese leadership fear is that they have a Potemkin military. China has not engaged in any major kind of warfare since the late 1960s, and they lost in 1969 against India, while the US and its NATO counterparts have been fighting for almost every single year since the 1950s. And Ukraine, which is on our side, is the most battle-hardened military on the planet. Then there's the fact that the Chinese economy is already struggling through deflation. Prices, along with worker wages, are falling. And the Chinese have already started complying against Russia's sanctions in August when the US merely threatened to take China's access away from the dollar. So the axis of evil and our competitors that we have been facing have suffered a huge string of losses. In fact, they haven't been this weak since the fall of the USSR in 1991. Compare that to the preceding years of World War I, where Germany took pieces of France, Denmark, and Austria, along with a bunch of African territory. They were the most battle-hardened, disciplined, and successful military in Europe at the time, and that's why everyone was terrified of them. And right before World War II, Germany annexed Austria again, took a piece of Czechoslovakia in 1938, and then the rest of it in 1939. While England and France were such sissy cowards that they kept trying to appease Germany, thinking that they wouldn't take any more, until, of course, Germany invaded Poland. Like I said, aggressive but successful land grabs. Russia has tried and failed. Iran is just a trapped deer in front of a tank's headlights. And it looks like China's trying to make a land grab for Russian territory. Our alliance, NATO, is made up of 32 countries, and we just had 3 new countries come in the past couple years. NATO gets to negotiate from a position of success and strength, while our enemies can't do anything close to that. Okay, but what about irrational actors like Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un of North Korea? Maybe they don't care who's stronger. They're just going to do an attack just because. You're right, and Putin did an irrational act when he invaded Ukraine. And Putin got to show the world that NATO just has to arm an enemy country against Russia, and they could hold their own. The axis of evil saw that, and for some reason, they're acting rationally and not attacking any neighbors. And let's not undermine the intelligence of the American military-industrial complex. Come on. They have been averaging around $800 billion a year in today's dollars of military spending since 1945. That's more than $50 trillion we have been spending as the world's #1 military power for those 79 years. This is America's military spending compared to everybody else's. And it looks like China is spending more than $292 billion, maybe $700 billion, but they've been doing that for about 7 years. We are 72 years ahead of ultimate military spending, ahead of them. That military spending, while I'm sure a lot of it did go to waste, was devoted not just to having a little bit more of a competitive edge to our competitors, it was to making sure we could obliterate and overwhelm any irrational actor with some kind of power. I'm not saying that the US or NATO is invulnerable, far from it. In order for a war to take place at the same scale of World War I or World War II, or even more, there has to be some chance of victory or horrible damage that the enemy can cause, which just isn't there. Putin has made it very clear that he's not going to launch nukes because every red line he sets, we cross, and he doesn't do anything. He's not exhibiting restraint out of any kind of benevolence. His military probably isn't even sure that whatever missiles he'd like to launch would actually work. They may end up landing somewhere else, in Russia. For those of you who are thinking we're already in World War III and we've been at this war for over a decade, there is always a Cold War between rival powers. This is nothing new. It has always been. Especially when we endured the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when Russian warships were actually right off the coast of Florida. And yes, there are Russian and even Chinese ships off our coasts right now, but they don't even pose a fraction of the threat that they did in the early 1960s. We have the best satellite and surveillance system on the planet. We probably know more about the Russian and Chinese ships than they do right now. It's the same reason why we let China's balloon fly into this country. I am the Geo Hussar. You only wage a war if you are coming from a position of strength and you have some chance of winning, which our enemies don't. Thanks for watching.